So we have two disjointed theories, right? Classical physics, classical mechanics, and you have electrodynamics and optics. Now, classical mechanics has a principle of relativity called the Galilean relativity, and Newton's laws of equations are invariant under the Galilean relativity, which we showed in class. On the other hand, what this means is that the classical mechanical phenomena are invariant when you move from one inertial frame to another inertial frame. All inertial frames are identical as far as the phenomena of classical mechanics are concerned. On the other hand, you have electrodynamics and optics, which deal with light, and the speed of light was measured, and this speed of light came out to be some 3 times 10 to the power of 8 meters per second. And this speed of light also appears in the Maxwell's equations. So now the natural question is, what is the speed relative to? Because if you think in terms of mechanics, speed is always relative to a particular frame. So what is the speed relative to? Now, if you apply the Galilean transformation to electrodynamics, meaning if you go to a frame of reference which is moving with respect to a certain, with respect to your lab, with a certain speed v, the speed of light that you measure should be c plus minus v, depending on the direction in which the source is situated, as well as the direction in which you are moving relative to the propagation of light. So this is the basic idea. Okay, so now, but that was never observed. In the sense, this is what the Michelson-Morley experiment tried to do. What it tried to do was to kind of measure the speed of light as a, in various directions, assuming a particular direction of motion for the Earth. What is the difference in the speeds of light in the various directions? And they did this experiment at various times of the day and various times of the year, because the Earth is spinning as well as rotating around the sun. So in both these cases, over the entire period, and the precision of the experiment was such that they could detect a shift of 1/100th of the observed fringe width. And according to their calculations, they expected, assuming Galilean relativity and this, the speed of light being so and so, assuming these two, you get a fringe width of roughly 40% of a fringe of a measured fringe width. So the precision was much more than what they should have measured, but despite that, they did not measure anything in any instance, meaning it was not like it was not a statistical result where they had to rely on statistics to throw it out. In every instance, the velocity of the velocity of the Earth that they could decipher came out to be 0 relative to the ether. That's what I mean. Relative to the ether, the hypothetical ether, which is supposed to be in this static rest frame.
So, but it may also due to very large velocity of the light, right?
That is precisely what I meant by the precision of the experiment was such that they could detect fringe widths of 1/100th of a fringe, meaning they calibrated their experiment such that small velocities of the order that of 30 kilometers per second compared to the 3 lakh kilometers per second could still be detected. That is what I mean.
Okay, so through this experiment, the concept of ether is completely thrown away.
Exactly.
Also,
But
we are applying Galilean relativity to electromagnetism in this experiment. I don't get that point clearly. We are
well, that
applying
was
Galilean relativity to
we are
mechanics here, but
we are applying Galilean relativity to the motion of the Earth relative to ether, and thereby Because according to classical physics, if you have a wave which is moving at a certain velocity v in a particular frame, if you move along the wave with a different velocity u, the velocity that you measure relative to your frame will be v minus u. And I gave the example of a surfer, right? A surfer surfs the waves. Therefore, with respect to the surfer, the velocity of the wave is 0, right?
Yes.
So this is the classical mechanical transformation that holds for water waves, sound waves, etc., which move at a smaller speed. But for light, they wanted to do this experiment, and the way they could do this experiment was using the Michelson-Morley interferometer. And okay, so let us, recap that briefly. That will be clearer then. So before the Michelson-Morley experiment, we had, yeah, Kenil, you have another question?
Sir, actually, the speed of light was this c in the ether frame, right? According to
Yes,
classical. But
yes,
now we are measuring the speed in Earth frame, and
excellent.
Earth is not an inertial frame, right?
No, no, Earth is an inertial frame.
But
Earth
it
is
accelerated.
approximately an inertial frame, but it is not at rest with respect to the ether. That is the central point in that experiment.
But it's undergoing accelerated motion, orbital motion.
Very, very negligible, because the trajectory has such a large radius, right? So at any instant on the time scales of movement of the Earth, sorry, on the time scales of the experiment, the Earth is pretty much an inertial frame. You don't sense the rotation of the Earth during that. This point we also discussed earlier, right? All the laws of Newton's laws and other things were deduced on the Earth, because the Earth was more or less approximately an inertial frame. They did
Okay.
not go to outer space to deduce these laws. They actually deduced them on the Earth, because the motion of the Earth is more or less uniform and on the timescales of any real human experiment that we do. If we do experiments for several months and years, then of course we do see the effects of these acceleration. But for optics experiments and other general mechanics experiments that we do over a few seconds or minutes, you don't sense any effect of the acceleration, and therefore it's pretty much an inertial frame for that purpose.
Okay, sir, got it.
Yeah, but even Newton, at the time of Newton, he realized that the Earth was only an approximate inertial frame, and therefore he stated his laws of mechanics, the first law, as when a body is far removed from all other bodies within its vicinity, then the body continues to move in, because to him, the forces that can act on the body are purely gravitational, because all bodies are neutral as far as charge is concerned. So the only force that exists between macroscopic bodies is gravitational. So the absence of force to him meant taking the body far away from any gravitational source, which is mass. Okay. So that is the state. So the logic of relativity is as follows. So we have these three options. Classical mechanics has principle of relativity, meaning all inertial frames are equivalent. E&M suggests an absolute rest frame for ether. Okay, so these two contradict each other. And moreover, laws of EM are not invariant under, when I say invariant, you should always take it to be invariant in form. Okay, under Galilean transformations. Okay, and the speed of light, according to Galilean Newtonian relativity should be c plus minus v for a frame moving at v. And this is purely by analogy with water waves, etc. All mechanical waves that we know satisfy this property. So now this was the situation. And this leads to three possibilities. Okay, this leads to three possibilities, which is that classical mechanics and EM are disconnected as far as relativity is concerned, relativity principle is concerned. What do I mean by that? That they don't both satisfy the principle of relativity. This is the first option. You just say the status of things remains as it is. Electromagnetic phenomena and optical phenomena will not satisfy the principle of relativity, and they will have an absolute frame of rest, ether. Or two, the option is they both satisfy, both have relativity, but EM is wrong. This is the second option. Third option is they both have relativity, but classical mechanics is wrong. By classical mechanics is wrong, I mean Galilean transformation is wrong. Because that is what classical mechanics, transformation and Newton's laws, etc. are need to be adjusted. These are the three possibilities. And the Michelson-Morley experiment assumes, one, it assumes the static ether, and two, applies Galilean transformation to light propagation. Okay. And how did they do this experiment? You have an interferometer. You have L1 and L2. And you shine a light source from this side. So the light comes here and one part of the light goes through. It gets transmitted and reflected from a mirror here. Let us say M1. And there is another mirror here, M2. And the light that is reflected here goes like this and comes back. If you assume the ether is the ether wind being the ether is static, the earth is moving in this direction with respect to ether with a speed v. So the ether wind relative to the lab frame will be in that direction, which means the velocity of light that you measure going this way will be c plus v, sorry, c minus v, and the velocity of light coming this way will be c plus v. Whereas in this case, it's like the cross stream velocity, and we computed the time of flight for light t1 in this case, we computed the time of flight for light t1 in t2 in that case, and we computed delta 2, which is t2 minus t1. And then what we did was we rotated this apparatus by 90 degrees And we did the same calculation again, and we called it delta t prime. And delta t prime minus delta t is the quantity that we are interested in. Okay, and that quantity is non-zero. Okay, that quantity is non-zero, and it corresponds to a phase shift. Okay, the fringe shift of about 40% of fringe width. Okay, so if you measure fringes in the first case, you rotate the apparatus by 90% and look at the fringes should have shifted by 40%, almost half. And their experiment was precise to 1%, meaning you can change fringes through other effects also. For example, you put a slight delay, you vary the L1 and L2, then the time difference will vary and you can shift the fringes, and they calibrated their experiment to measure fringe shifts of 1%. So 40% should be very easily conspicuously visible, but they did not see anything. What this meant was that the Earth did not have any relative motion relative to the ether. Now this was the possibility, or so there were two possibilities out of this. One, Earth conclusions. Earth did not move relative to ether, or these are, I mean, I'm not saying these are the only two possibilities, but I'm saying these are two major possibilities. Or speed of light is constant. Okay, is constant no matter what the speed of Earth is. When I say speed of light measured on Earth is constant no matter what the speed of Earth is. Okay, so now these are the two conclusions. Now let us probe the first conclusion. People were just not ready at that point to accept the second conclusion, because to them it seemed like science fiction that the speed of an object, light being an object, could be such that no matter how fast you move, the speed of light will remain the same. That was unphysical according to their experience. So they now latched onto the first conclusion and tried all sorts of methods to explain the Michelson-Morley experiment. So efforts to explain the Michelson-Morley null result. Okay, null result is something that gives you a zero result, and now you have the problem of explaining that. Okay, so what were the various efforts? We are not going to spend a lot of time on these efforts, but I will quickly mention some of the really fantastic things that people suggested. Now, the first was what was called the ether drag hypothesis. Okay, the ether drag hypothesis meant that every massive object dragged the ether along with it. Now, obviously, you can see that this would suggest a zero relative velocity with respect to the ether for the Earth, because the ether around the Earth is now moving with the Earth. Okay, of course, they should have already thought of various problems, because the ether around every massive object was moving with respect to that massive object, and there would be all sorts of turbulence in the ether, etc., etc. But they did not even go that far. The ether drag hypothesis was suggested, but this was contradicted by two experiments. Okay, but this falls flat. One, due to stellar aberration. You remember the stellar aberration effect, where if you put a telescope on the Earth, the telescope has to be rotated by in a circle of diameter which had 40 arc seconds, 41 arc seconds or something. the fixed stars, the stars which were so-called fixed relative to the Earth, right? They rotated in small circles which had a diameter in angular units of 41 arc seconds. Now, if the ether were, and this entire calculation was based on the relative motion of the Earth relative to the ether. So this experiment has a ready explanation, or this effect has a ready explanation in the static ether hypothesis. So the ether drag hypothesis cannot explain this. That was one problem. The other problem was that of the Fizeau. This Fizeau did several optics experiments. We already discussed the measurement of speed of light using a cogged wheel. He also did, a similar measurement using an interferometer, sort of, not interferometer, but a sort of an interference experiment, where he took, he passed light. So there is a water flow. Let us say there is a water flow. Let's say water flow is like this. So the water is flowing, and these are pipes. So let us put them like this. So the water is flowing like this, right? And at some 7 meters per second. And you shine light through this, and there is a beam splitter, and you have a telescope here. The human eye is observing this, and you have one beam go like this against the water, and one beam go along the water. Now, the propagation of light inside moving fluids was already being studied. Okay, the properties of light, Fresnel, in fact, came up with an expression that if the water is flowing with a speed v, and if n is the refractive index of the fluid, let us say you take a fluid, you can take oil, you can take water, whatever. The fluid has some refractive index n, and we all know from simple geometric optics, from the laws of refraction, that the speed of light in free space, if it is c, inside a medium with a refractive index n, it is c by n. So the speed of, according to Galilean relativity, this speed inside the moving fluid should have been c by n plus minus v. But what Fresnel found was that it was not c by n plus minus v. He used the laws of electrodynamics. He used the laws of, remember that he did not use Galilean relativity. He actually computed the polarization of the liquid and blah, blah, blah. And he computed, using the laws of electrodynamics, he tried to compute what the speed of the light inside the medium would be, inside a polarizable medium, which is moving with a certain speed would be. And he found an approximate formula which went like this. C by n plus minus v times 1 minus 1 by n squared. And as 1 minus 1 by n squared is a factor which is less than 1, this speed was not exactly c by n plus minus v as Galilean relativity would predict. Speed of light in a moving dielectric. That's what this formula is for, with refractive index n. This is not c by n plus minus v as predicted by Galilean relativity. Okay. Now, Fresnel himself did not make this observation that this is not the same as what you would get from Galilean relativity, but Fizeau and others thought about this and they were puzzled. And Fizeau did the experiment and he actually verified this formula. He verified this formula that this is the case. Now, think about this hypothesis of the ether being dragged. Now, if the speed of light is c with respect to ether, and if the liquid is dragging the ether along with it, then the speed of light inside the liquid should be C plus V, meaning in the lab frame should be C plus V. With respect to the liquid, it will be C. So this formula doesn't somehow agree with what with the ether drag hypothesis. So the ether drag hypothesis had to be abandoned. And then people came up with even more fantastic theories. So the most fantastic of those is called the contraction theory by Lorentz and Fitzgerald. Now, what is this theory saying? This theory is saying, okay, the goal is to basically explain the Michelson-Morley experiment. Okay, in the Michelson-Morley experiment, the time of flight along the direction of motion with respect to the ether and the time of flight along the perpendicular direction were different. That is what gave rise to the non-zero fringe shift. They said, well, let us come up with a hypothesis that all objects contract in the direction of motion with respect to the ether and don't change in size perpendicular to the direction. And this, as you can clearly see, will give you exactly zero fringe shift for the Michelson-Morley experiment. But this had other very deep problems. This required a change of laws of electromagnetism, and several things were predicted. Several electromagnetic effects were predicted by Lorentz Fitzgerald theory of contraction, and none of those could be found experimentally. They were all negated by experiment. Several EM predictions of Lorentz were invalidated. So this theory also had to go. So then the attempts to resuscitate an ether basically fell flat. And any contrived sort of modification of electromagnetic laws also fell flat. So then if you look at those three options, Michelson-Morley experiment already says there is no ether. So the first option keeps going out in all the cases. Of the two options, EM is wrong. This second option also goes out thanks to Lorentz contraction theory and the lack of experimental evidence for it. And this was not, Lorentz contraction theory was not the only theory which tried to modify the laws of, or which tried to modify the laws of electrodynamics. They even came up with theories like, in hindsight, I mean, hindsight is always 20/20, right? In hindsight, you always look at it and say, how come they even thought of all these things when such a simple conclusion was staring at them? But that is how the progress of any field is. I mean, people are hung up on their experience, so they even came up with theories such as this. They are called emission theories, where the speed of light depends on the speed of light is c, not with respect to the ether, but with respect to the object that is emitting it. So they did a Michelson-Morley experiment, not with a terrestrial source like like the original Michelson-Morley experiment, but with a extraterrestrial source, with a moving object like binary stars, etc., etc. And they did not see anything. They did not measure any fringe shift in any case. So even this sort of emission theory that the speed of light is c with respect to the source velocity, and therefore not with respect to ether, and all these kind of things basically fell flat. Now this was the situation around 19 not, sorry, go on.
How this how we are calling this as theories, because it doesn't have any
Hypothesis.
proof, it is called
Hypothesis.
hypothesis, right?
Exactly. Hypothesis. I don't mean I'm using theory in a loose sense. You are right in pointing out that these are not theories. These are only hypotheses.
Okay.
Correct. Okay. Now that was when this was the situation. The main players in this entire thing were Fizeau, Fresnel, Lorentz, and Poincaré. Okay, these were the people who did a lot of this work, and they were basically watching. They had all the pieces of the puzzle in front of them. They did not have how this the one missing piece, which was basically courage to put them all together. That is where Mr. Einstein, essentially he had that one piece. He held the one key card which nobody else had. The simple conviction that, and how did he base his conviction on? He analyzed the simple experiment of, you have a car in which you have a coil, and these are the north and south poles of a magnet. North and south poles of a magnet. Let us say this car is moving with the plane of the coil perpendicular to the direction of the magnets, and the person inside the car measures an EMF E, and he says that the magnetic field is changing. The coil is static with respect to him, and the magnetic field is changing. So according to Lenz's law, this is how I would predict the magnitude of the EMF that is produced in the coil. This is explanation number one. From a ground observer, his perspective, the magnetic field is at rest. It's a constant magnetic field, and the coil is moving. Now, when the coil is moving, the electrons or the particles inside the coil, the charges inside the coil are moving. And we know from Biot-Savart's law and Ampere's law that moving charges and Lorentz force, we know that moving charges experience a force in a magnetic field. And that force can be computed using Lorentz force, and that results in an EMF due to Lorentz force. And these both EMFs agree exactly between the two. And what Einstein noticed with both these explanations were perfectly valid according to the laws of electrodynamics. Both explanations were valid as per E and M. So this means E and M should satisfy principle of relativity. Of course, we know that it doesn't satisfy the principle of Galilean relativity. That is not the question anymore. It satisfies the principle of relativity, but the Galilean transformation doesn't work. So we need a new transformation. Okay, now, and this was one thing. E and M also satisfies the principle of relativity. This was, let us call it A. And B was, he noticed the, he looked at the Michelson-Morley experiment, and he said, well, the speed of light, the Michelson-Morley experiment essentially concludes that the speed of light is the same in all inertial frames. Okay, so he said, why don't we just run with that conclusion and see what happens? So he said, speed of light is the same in all inertial frames. Now, looking at these two, it immediately struck him. So he came up with the postulates of what he called special relativity. I'll explain the term special. The first postulate if you remember Newtonian relativity, it said the laws of classical mechanics are invariant in form when you go from one inertial frame to another inertial frame. What Einstein did was a very natural, extension of that and said all laws of physics, now this is a much stronger statement, are invariant in form across inertial frames. This is the first law, first postulate. Okay. And the second postulate, which is usually stated as a separate postulate, but in my opinion is already subsumed by the first postulate, is that the law of constancy it's called the law of constancy of speed of light, which means speed of light in vacuum is measured to be c in all inertial frames. Okay. Now, the reason I say that this second postulate is really not a separate postulate, because when you say that all laws of physics are invariant in form across inertial frames, the law of constancy of speed of light is also one of the physical laws. But up until that point, it was not considered so. So Einstein explicitly made it a law. He said that the speed of light is a constant in all inertial frames, and this is a fundamental fact of nature. Let us not argue about it, because experiments invariably and incontrovertibly show this fact. So let us accept it, make it a part of our physical laws, and see what happens. Now, this was a huge step. This was precisely what the others did not want to do. And this is all what Einstein did. And he needed,
So,
yeah, go on.
but how does it make sense that even if we are, no matter how much velocity we are going against the light, still we are measuring the velocity of light as c?
How does it intuitively make sense?
Yeah.
I will tell you. Einstein was working on the problem of, so I'll give you a bit of history in a few minutes. You will know. Yes, your question is absolutely right. So how did he get the courage to do this? Because he was actually looking at a different problem in classical physics. He was interested in the problem of absolute time that classical physics was proposing when you go from one inertial frame to another inertial frame. What Einstein asked, we'll get to this in a few minutes, but the question that Einstein asked was, when you say that the time is the same across inertial frames, what does that statement even mean? And he went into a very deep fundamental analysis of what time means. And this is a question that he was interested since he was 16. And he came up with a very sound way of defining time. And because the speed of light was already measured in the 1700s, and he knew that the speed of light was some very large number, he constructed an experimental method of measuring time using light. And while he had already done that, the later developments in Michelson-Morley and all these experiments kind of gave him a clue that the other study that he was doing about defining time and etc. may be the clue to solve this problem. And that is how that is basically how he solved it. We will get to that in a few minutes. Don't rush. We will get there. Okay, so these were the two postulates, and now using these two postulates, you can do a very simple analysis. Okay, let us first, we will not do a very usual textbook sort of thing where you first use these two to derive the Lorentz transformations, etc. Let us try a much simpler thing. If the law of speed of light is this, if the speed of light is the same in all inertial frames, naturally, if you have an inertial frame which is moving with, which is at rest, let us say, and you have another inertial frame S prime, which is moving with a speed v along the x-axis, let us say, and you have an object which is moving with a velocity u, then the speed w that is measured with respect to S prime for this object which is moving with u relative to S will be u minus v according to Galilean relativity. But this second law of second postulate that Einstein came up with obviously contradicts this. So we need to now find a new velocity addition rule, a new velocity addition rule, and we will do a slightly unconventional addition rule. Okay, we will do a slightly unconventional derivation of this new addition rule. Okay, let us say this w is basically some f, some function of u and v, and I put a colon here because u relative to v. Basically, what we need is a function of u in a frame moving with v, and this transformation should give you the correct w that is measured with respect to the moving frame. Okay, now this is a function of two variables u and v, right? Now what properties do we require of this function? What properties do we require of this function? We require, on the one hand, okay, just hold on for a minute. Okay, yeah, so sorry, something is happening here. I just need to. All right, fine. Okay, so let us do this. So we need a function which has the following properties. What are the properties of f? F. According to simple classical physics, let's say when u is less than c and v is less than c, we know how this function should behave. When u is much less than c, f of u v should be approximately u minus v. This we know should tend to u minus v, right? This we know. This is the first property. Any function that you construct should give you the Galilean transformation, Galilean velocity addition rule when you go to small speeds, because that is what you observe. You can't have a function which doesn't satisfy that property. This is one property. And two, okay, so we are now, so we can say, assume f u v to be some function g u v times u minus v, where g u v 1 is dimensionless and g u v goes to 1 as u is much less than c and v is much less than c. Sorry, my less thans also look like c. Sorry for
Sir?
that. Yeah.
Isn't this velocity addition? So shouldn't be u plus v or something?
No. Addition, subtraction are basically the same thing, right?
Okay, so this is velocity of the u observer with respect to the v observer, or other way around?
Exactly. It is the velocity that you measure in the moving frame when the original velocity is given to be u with respect to the static frame. I'm calling it velocity addition rule because Einstein called it that, but addition subtraction are basically the same operation with negative numbers. Yeah, and you can think of it as vector addition. Yes, true. We won't be doing the full vector formalism for this formula. I'm just deriving a simple result where where the relative motion and the motion of that object are along the same direction. They may have a plus minus sign. It may be either parallel or anti-parallel, but that's it. We are considering only one-dimensional motion. Okay, is that clear, Raghuram?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Now, so this function GUV has to satisfy this property that it is first dimensionless and it goes to 1 as u is much less than c and v is much less than c. Now, how do you construct a simple dimensionless expression using two velocities which are of the same dimension? You can just say u by v or v by u may be one possible form that appears within this g of uv. In the sense, you can say that the g of uv can have a form of some g of u by v or v by u, but that won't work because this function should not have any pathological properties when one of the velocities goes to 0. This f has very clean properties when so for example, f of u 0 should give you u. So it cannot be this g of u by v, g of uv cannot have any form like u by v or something like that. And similarly, f of 0v should give you minus v. So this velocity transformation never gives you an infinite or indeterminate value. It always gives you some nice clean value. Okay, so what other dimensionless quantity do you have? You have u by v. Sorry, you have u by v or v by u. These are dimensionless. Or you also have u by c and v by c, which are dimensionless. Right? And let us also see now that if you have f of u v, if you switch the roles, this should be f of minus of f of vu, meaning what we are saying here is basically that if you measure an object which is moving with a speed v, if you measure an object which is moving with a speed u with respect to one frame, in a frame which is moving with respect to speed v, if you now measure the frame velocity, the velocity of that frame relative to that object, which is measuring with a speed u, then that should be minus of the other relative velocity. What we are basically saying is if two objects are moving relative to each other, the relative velocity that one measures with respect to the other will be the negative of each other. This is a fairly empirical fact which this transformation should also satisfy, which immediately tells you that GUV is a symmetric function. I'm doing a very unorthodox derivation. This is not how you will find this formula derived anywhere. This is a derivation that I cooked up sometime in my grad school, but I find it, interesting for the following reason, that this is fairly generic. You can actually do such a derivation for various other fields, not just for relativity, but that's why I'm thinking it may be a little illustrative to actually go through this process. So GUV is a symmetric function. Now GUV should be 1, it should tend to 1 for small uv, and it should also be a symmetric function. So we can easily say that GUV is actually of the form GUV by c squared because it should be dimensionless and it should be symmetric. Okay, and if you have it in this form, uv by c squared is a dimensionless quantity. It's a guess. Okay, by the way, this is not some rigorous mathematical derivation. It's a guess. If it is of the form uv by c squared, then it satisfies the u and v are in symmetric, position as far as the function g is concerned, and uv by c squared is a dimensionless quantity, and you can always ignore uv by c squared for small values of u and v. Okay, so this is the form. Therefore, f of uv can be now written as g of uv by c squared times u minus v. Now we use the property that f of, this is a very important property, by the way. If the object that you are measuring in the static frame is light, if this speed u is actually the speed of light, this function should have c. Okay, meaning the velocity transformation. This is what Einstein's second postulate means, that if you have a frame that is moving with a finite velocity v, and you want to measure the speed of light, which is measured to be c with respect to some other frame, in this frame also you should measure c only. Now, this also means the following, which is quite interesting. Both these expressions should give rise to c, meaning if you have a ray of light which is going along the positive direction, x direction, a frame that is moving along the positive x direction or the negative x direction should give you the same speed c as measured along the positive x direction. So in both cases, it should be c. Okay, now let us plug in this into this formula. The first case will give you, okay, g of uv by c squared times u minus v will go to g of v by c, okay, times u minus v, in that case will be c minus v. Okay, g of v by c times c minus v will be c. This is one expression. G of the second expression is minus v by c times c plus v, right? G of will be equal to c. Doesn't matter. Let us look at these expressions like this. G of v by c is c by c minus v. This is 1 by 1 minus v by c. We are already there. And g of minus v by c is c by c plus v, which is 1 by 1 minus v by c. From these two expressions, you can easily say that g of uv by c squared has to be 1 by 1 minus uv by c squared. Because if g of x is 1 by 1 minus x, that's what we derived from these two. So g of x is 1 by 1 minus x, therefore g of uv by c squared has to be 1 by 1 minus uv by c squared. Therefore, the velocity w that you measure with respect to the moving frame has to be u minus v by 1 minus uv by c squared. This is a completely different law, but it has all the nice properties that agree both with Newton and Einstein.
Sir?
Yeah.
What reason is there for expecting g depends on u by c times v by c instead of u by c plus v by c or any other symmetric function?
So that's a good question. It's a guess. Okay, so the reason is this: we want g to be, there are two factors here. G has to be a symmetric function, and we know that uv is a symmetric function. Okay, and g also has to be such that g goes to 1 when for all values of ub which are much less than c, which means c has to be part of it, and g also has to be a dimensionless quantity. So putting all these three factors together, a reasonable guess, I'm not saying that's why I said it's not a rigorous mathematical derivation, but a reasonable guess is that g has to be of the form g of uv by c squared, because uv by c squared can then become negligible when u and v are much smaller than c. uv by c squared is dimensionless. So the entire function is g of uv by c squared, which will be dimensionless because that's the only argument of the function. If the argument of the function is dimensionless, the function has to be dimensionless, right? And I mean, from a mathematical perspective. And uv by c squared is a symmetric expression. So it doesn't put u or v in a special status. They are exactly symmetric as far as the function g are concerned. G is concerned. Using all three factors, we come up with an expression saying that g has to be of the form g of uv by c squared. And then putting it into this second postulate of relativity, we have now derived this is the Einstein velocity addition rule. This derivation is, one can obviously poke holes in the derivation in all likelihood, but the point of the derivation is not to be very rigorous, but to also highlight another aspect. In the sense, I presented this derivation before we went and did Lorentz transformations, which will be what I will be doing probably in the next 5 minutes. But the reason for doing this is, based on the postulates, you can derive a lot of information by using some of your mathematical intuition. You don't need the Lorentz transformations. Actually, Einstein did not give such a derivation. He derived the Lorentz transformations first, and then he applied the Lorentz transformations, and you get exactly the same results that way. This was just, when I was in my PhD and I was bored one afternoon, I said, oh, let us see if just the postulates can give you some clue to give you a formula for your velocity addition rule, and you make some reasonable guesses. Of course, you may say, one may argue that your reasonable guess may be again influenced by the end result that you already know. Well, even in that case, it's still a reasonable guess and it's a derivation. It won't be a discovery, but it'll be a derivation. That's all. So this is the new velocity addition rule, and you can easily verify that the moment you put any of these velocities to c, when you make u, 1 minute, yeah. The moment you make any of these velocities equal to c, the relative velocity will automatically come out to be c. Okay, so I will leave that verification to you. But now let us go ahead. And this was already a very important discovery. And Einstein,
Sir,
yeah.
what if both u and v are c?
That's a very good question. Then this formula actually preserves, this formula will not, it will not give you a determinate expression. It will not give you a determinate expression, but you can see that the order of the numerator and the denominator are actually different. So you have to compute a limit. You have to compute a limit and then determine what the relative velocity is going to be. But that is not a practically possible scenario because there can be no inertial frame. And this is not something that, there can be no inertial frame that can move at the speed of light. Therefore, that possibility doesn't exist. Now, there is a very deep reason why that is so, and we will understand that probably in Friday's class. This relates to what Senin asked earlier. What is the intuition that Einstein had to suggest this postulate, the second postulate, which the others did not? The reason for that is light, the speed of light. What Einstein discovered was that the speed of light is not like the speed of any other object in a frame of reference, in the sense that speed of any object is basically the rate at which the coordinate or the position vector of that object, if you want to call velocity, then it is the rate at which the position vector of an object moves in a particular frame of reference. What Einstein figured out was the speed of light was not just like any other object, but it was actually what was defining the measurement of time and the measurement of spatial distance. Meaning, light had the fundamental property that measurements of time can be defined in terms of the speed of light. Therefore, the speed of light is not like any other object because it sets the standard. For example, the kilogram mass that they used to keep in the Louvre Museum until the mass of that it used to be the standard for all kilograms across the world, right? For until a few years back. Now that it changed, of course. Now the carbon atomic mass became the standard. But until a few years back, that standard used to be. Now, how do you define a kilogram? You define a kilogram in units of that kilogram which is sitting somewhere in Paris under controlled environment. In the same way, the speed of every object is measured with respect to the speed of light, in the sense that the time that you define for a frame of reference has light hardwired into it. So this will be the topic for Friday's discussion, but that is the basic idea. Does that clarify?
So he introduced the velocity of light as a fundamental constant of the universe.
Not just that, yes, he did introduce. It was Einstein who introduced the velocity of light as a fundamental constant of the universe. Yes, which is true.
But yeah, still it's not so intuitive, but we can accept the fact that.
No, it's not intuitive. It's not intuitive, but it is a fact he was forced to, it was a postulate that he was forced to make based purely on experimental evidence. Einstein was a guy who never worked, the theoretical physicists of the early 20th century were not completely divorced from experimental results. They looked at experimental results and their theory was well grounded in that. And this postulate it was like he was backed into a corner. He had no other way to do that. Okay, so now in the last few minutes, I want to do a derivation of the Lorentz transformations. So it's not a very difficult derivation by any means. So let us just do that. Okay, so now what is the meaning of Lorentz transformations? Why do we want to go for Lorentz transformations? We derived a velocity addition rule that doesn't satisfy the Newtonian principle. So W is not equal to U minus V, but W is equal to U minus V by 1 minus UV by C squared. So C is now part of this velocity addition rule. For U, V much less than C, W becomes U minus V. That is how we derived this rule, right? Now this naturally means that the transformation that X prime is X minus Vt, Y prime is Y, Z prime is Z, and T prime is T is not correct anymore, because this is how you get by doing dx prime by dt prime equal to dx by dt minus v, because t prime is t. This is precisely how you get w equal to u minus v. So this transformation equation and the velocity addition rule are not independent of each other. So we now need a transformation which doesn't look like this, which features C such that you get the Einstein velocity addition rule out of that transformation. That's the goal. So how do we do this? So we have let us take a frame XYZ, and we have another frame S prime. This is S, and this is X prime, Y prime, Z prime. And this has a time t, and this has a time t prime. Okay, and the origin of this frame is moving at a speed v relative to the older frame. Okay, so now this is exactly the setup, and we want to know what x prime, y prime, z prime are. Now let us send out a pulse of light, okay, at t equal to 0. At t equal to 0, assume that the two frames coincide. Okay, by that we mean that both s and s prime have their axes exactly at the same location. The origins are aligned. The origins are the same at t equal to 0, where both the frames are basically like this, and this frame starts moving like this, etc., etc. Now we know that we know from Galilean relativity already y prime is y and z prime is z. So let us not even bother about these two transformations because those transformations are not changing. So we only want x and x prime, and we want x prime and t prime in terms of x. So we want to fill in these gaps basically. In the Newtonian case, this would be x minus vt, but we know that is not true anymore. So let us look for a new transformation of this form. Okay, so we know that if you have a ray of light, x will be ct. In the first frame of reference, a small pulse of light that is emitted at the origin propagates along the x direction according to this law, right? And let us say this has to be the case because of the speed of light being a constant. Even in the second frame, we need this to be satisfied. Okay, so what this means essentially is x minus ct is 0 and x prime minus ct prime is 0. So x minus ct has to be some lambda times x prime minus ct prime. This is the derivation that Einstein himself gave. So let us look at this. So x minus ct is lambda times x prime minus ct prime. And if you now consider a second pulse, which was emitted at the origin, but in the minus x direction, then x plus ct will be 0 for this. This is pulse 1 along positive x. This is pulse 2 along negative x. X plus ct is 0 and x prime plus ct prime is 0. Therefore, x plus ct will be some mu times x prime plus ct prime. And from this, you can define two constants. Okay, a being lambda plus mu by 2. Okay, and b being lambda minus mu by 2, and you can write x prime equal to, okay, sorry, the way I am writing it, this has to be the primed on the left side. Otherwise you will get into all sorts of, yeah, that is fine. So from this we get a x plus b times ct. Okay, that is x prime. You just take this equation and you expand. You write a plus b by 2. That's all. Lambda is a plus b by 2. And y prime, sorry, t prime will be ACT or CT prime. In fact, CT prime will be ACT minus BX. Okay, so we now have an equation that connects x prime with x and t prime with x and t, if only we know these two constants a and b. How do we know a and b? We know that if we set x prime equal to 0, if we set x prime equal to 0, then we have x equal to, okay, we have x equal to, sorry, I got the sign here wrong. It should be minus. Yeah. We have x prime equal to, if you set x prime equal to 0 in this equation, the first equation, we get x equal to CB by A times T. But x prime equal to 0 is the origin of the second moving frame, which means the coordinate of that origin according to the first frame should be x equal to Vt. Therefore, CB by A should be V, which means B by A should be V by C. This is one equation that you get. Okay. Now you think of something, which is that you take a length. Okay, you take a length which is say 1 meter or some 1 unit. Let us say we take a length which is 1 unit. So let us now consider this particular case. Let's take a unit length. Okay, let's take a unit length which is between x1 and x2. Okay, in the frame S prime, x2 minus x1. So delta x prime will be x2 prime minus x1 prime. Okay, that's the unit, that's the length that we are considering. Now, if you do the Lorentz transformations, meaning, sorry, if you do this transformation, we get x2 prime will be some ax2 minus bct at some time t. Okay, that is what we are doing. And x1 prime will be ax1 minus bct. That is at the same time t, the two coordinates as measured in this frame S are x2 and x1. So what we now see is x1 prime minus x2 prime will be a times x2 minus x1. Okay. Now, if you, so what this means basically is that an interval delta x prime here will be a times delta x, right? And if delta x prime is 1, then yeah, then delta x will be 1 by a. So that's just, so this is the other equation that we have. Delta x prime is a times delta x. Now, if you, yeah, okay, I think now if you take these two equations, right, and let us eliminate t from these two equations. Okay, let us see. Okay, here is what I want to do. Let us say this is at t prime equal to 0, and it is at some t in this frame. At t prime equal to 0, you specify the length of these two, and at some t in this frame, you specify the coordinates x2 and x1, and the difference between these two gives the length that is measured in this frame S. Now, you take these transformation equations, which is x prime equal to ax minus b times ct, and ct prime equal to, sorry, just 2 more minutes and we'll finish this. A times ct minus b times x, and you put t prime equal to 0. Okay, therefore x prime equal to ax minus b times ct, and ct equal to bx by a. So now you put this into this. So x prime will be equal to ax minus b squared by a x. Okay. Yeah, instead of ct, I'm putting bx by a. So it will be b squared by ax. So it will be a times x 1 minus b squared by a squared is x prime. So if you see 1 minus b squared by a squared, yeah, exactly. So what we have concluded now is that the 2 points of the x-axis separated by this distance. Okay. What we have now concluded is the following, that if you have, so this basically gives you delta x. Let me just see if the math is coming out correctly. X prime, delta x prime is a times delta x. That is correct. And yeah, okay. Let us now consider delta x prime equal to 1. Then we simply have delta x equal to 1 by a. This is a consequence of that. And now what we are doing is we have constructed a transformation, and we also know that b by a is v by c. B by a is v by c. So let us put that. So x prime will be equal to ax times 1 minus v squared by c squared. Okay. So all right. All right. So now what do we have here? We have x prime as a function of x. From this, we can conclude that okay, okay, okay. Yeah. So if we now consider the point where x is equal to 1, meaning that if we consider a unit length, then the coordinate of that point will be a times 1 minus v squared by c squared. Right? But these two lengths, meaning a unit length. Yeah, exactly. So what we are saying is the following. If you consider a unit length, in the k prime frame or in the s prime frame, the length that is measured of that object will be 1 by a in the s frame. If you consider a unit length in the s frame, the length that is measured by an object by in the s prime frame will be a times 1 minus v squared by c squared. But by the principle of relativity, the length of a unit segment cannot change, meaning in a particular frame, if the length of a unit segment is 1, the one that is measured in the other frame should exactly be 1 by a. So a times 1 minus v squared by c squared has to be equal to 1 by a, which immediately gives us a squared will be 1 by 1 minus v squared by c squared, or a is 1 by square root of 1 minus v squared by c squared. Usually this is denoted by the number gamma. Okay. Therefore, we now have the transformation, which is gamma times x minus b, which is b is b by v, b by a is v by c. V by c is usually denoted by beta. So b is nothing but gamma times beta. So this becomes gamma beta ct, and ct prime becomes gamma. Let us see. Yeah, it becomes, so this a times ct, right? Correct. Yeah, a times ct, which means it will be gamma times ct minus gamma beta times x. Will be b times x, sorry, not gamma beta, b times x, which is gamma beta times x. Correct. And y prime is y and z prime is z. So this here is what we call the Lorentz transformations. The derivation, I kind of messed up the math a little, but the idea of the derivation is the following. Let me just quickly say it in words and you can go back and I didn't mess up the math. I just, did the math a little in my head without explaining it very clearly. The idea is the following. You use the fact that a pulse of light that is moving with respect to, the frame S and the frame S prime have the same speed. And you construct the form of the transformation as some A times X minus B times CT. And similarly for T prime, and you get these two equations out of that property. And then you are applying this to, you take a particular line segment in each frame. Let us take a unit line segment in the S frame and see how it is measured in the S prime frame. And you take a unit line segment in the S prime frame and see how it is measured in the S frame. These two frames are moving relative to each other, so each of these frames should measure the other line segment exactly the same way. And from this transformation, we constructed x prime as a function of x and delta x prime as a function of delta x. So by equating these two, we got an formula for A. And we already knew that the origin of the second frame was moving with a velocity v. Using that fact, we got a formula, we got an expression for B. So, or B by A. So now you know B by A from the velocity of the origin of one of the frames, and you know A from this consideration that a unit line segment should be perceived relative to the moving frame and relative to the static frame in exactly the same way in the other frame. That is, a line segment in a particular frame should be seen exactly the same way in the other frame with a certain factor A in front of it. And from that we computed this A squared, which is 1 by 1 minus V squared by C squared. So this is called the Lorentz transformation. Why is it not called the Einstein transformation? Because Lorentz had actually worked this out before using, in his Lorentz contraction theory, he needed this transformation. That is how he rationalized the Lorentz contraction theory, but the physics of that theory was all wrong. Even though the mathematical transformation was correct, it was Einstein who first noticed that this transformation is not about contraction of objects, but it is about the correct transformation across inertial frames. That was Einstein's realization, and this is Lorentz transformation. Now, as a simple exercise, you can do the following at home at leisure. Show that the velocity addition rule follows from this. This is easy to show, and to show that if delta L is a line segment measured in S, delta L prime of the same in S prime, show that delta L prime is not equal to delta L and find out the relation, meaning construct the relation. This is not something new. We have already done this. This is exactly the relation, but I want you to work it out yourself and show that delta L prime will actually come less than delta L. Or in fact, show that delta L prime will be equal to gamma times delta L. Show this. Sorry, 1 by gamma. What am I saying? Gamma is 1 by 1 minus square root of V squared. So this will be 1 by gamma times delta L. Show this. And then take a time interval delta t in S and delta t prime using the Lorentz transformations. Show that delta t prime of the same delta t that is measured in S prime will always come out greater than delta t, and show that delta t prime will come out gamma times delta t. Gamma is always greater than 1. And beta is v by c, which is always less than 1. Okay, show these. So this effect is called length contraction. And this effect is called time dilation. And we will look at the consequences of these in Fridays and later classes. Okay, so we will have a tutorial on Wednesday and we will have a class on Friday morning. Any questions? Sorry, the last derivation of Lorentz transformations might not be too clear, but it's very trivial in fact. So just I will discuss this again on Friday if there's any confusion, but go through the arguments. You can derive it yourself. Any questions? All right, so let us then meet on Friday. On Wednesday during 12 to 1, we will have the lecture.